Watercolor backgrounds can elevate your florals to a whole new level. But let's be honest, they can be so intimidating to paint. Welcome to Sunlit Brushstrokes. I'm Jessica, and today I'm sharing some of my favorite tips and examples to help you build backgrounds that feel soft, cohesive, and easy to manage, so they actually enhance your painting instead of stressing you out. Let's go ahead and get started. My first tip is to work wet on wet, where you go ahead and wet the entire background or a portion of your background with water or a light wash of paint, and then go ahead and drop your color in. Doing this will allow you to achieve soft, diffuse backgrounds like I've got here. I'll explain the process for this one a little bit more later, but you want to note this one is definitely very blurry and out of focus, which allows the flower that's the center point of our painting to pop. But you don't have to just have modeled, fully abstract backgrounds either. This one is also wet on wet. Now this painting is actually not a finished piece. You can see it, the little blossoms are still missing their centers, but I wanted to show you this background because I really feel like it gives you the impression of the tree with the blossoms kind of continuing on, and you can still see more branches and even the suggestion of more little blossoms or buds. With this painting, I wanted to give the impression of tall leaves like an iris has, but I didn't want them all in focus. And so you can see I did a wet on wet background, but I did long linear brush strokes so that I could achieve the look of there still being iris leaves in the background without them standing out too much. And then finally, this is an example of how you can have the impression of having a sky as well as grass. And this close-up clover bud looks like it's in context. My second tip is to try partial backgrounds. You probably recognize these paintings from my YouTube channel, but they're really good examples of partial backgrounds. I'll include a link to all 3 videos, but with all of them, I start with applying water first, and then some soft greens, or in this case pink, to create some soft, subtle effects without having to fill an entire background. I think if you're intimidated by backgrounds, this is an excellent way to get started. And honestly, in my mind, it's harder to mess these backgrounds up. With this one, I kept the colors quite subtle, whereas with this, as you can see, I went a little bit bolder and used more color. And so it's a little bit more of a full background, and yet you can see it's definitely fading out at this side. And so I consider it still kind of a partial background, and it was an easy background to paint. And trying something like this is a great step after you try something really subtle, like the hibiscus or this blossom background. And then when you're ready to try a full background, consider starting with the background first and painting the flower second. That's what I did on this video here, and you can find the full tutorial for that on my YouTube channel, and so I'll include a link for it in the description below. In this video, I teach you how I start from my lightest, warmest colors and gradually work into the cooler colors and the contrasting colors, as well as how I add a little bit of purple for color harmony. This project was so fun and easy. I would recommend it as a great way to start painting full backgrounds. And so that's my third tip, is to start with your background first. It's going to allow you to play and explore without having to be concerned about ruining a beautiful flower. Then when the background's dry, you can go ahead and add the flower. If you're not familiar with doing wet on wet backgrounds, a great way to practice is to take a small piece of watercolor paper like I've got here. This is a 140-pound cold press Arch watercolor paper, and that sounds kind of expensive for doing a little bit of practice. But this particular paper does hold water in a really nice way, and it's going to allow you to kind of understand how the water and the paper and the paint are going to interact when you're working on this paper for a larger painting. To get started, I like to apply my water first. My water's slightly tinted, but you can use clear water, you can use a slightly tinted water. You want to just go ahead and fill the whole paper in with water, and you want it to be relatively wet. You can even let it sit for a minute, let that kind of water absorb into the paper, and then come back over it and do a second wash of water just to make sure everything is saturated. You want this to stay wet for as long as possible. It's going to give you more freedom to keep playing around. So keep that in mind when you go to do your little practice sheet. So now that it's wet, I'm going to go ahead and drop in some color. Now, for those of you who know how I like to work with color, I like to start with my lightest color first, which is yellow. And then I work my way down the color wheel, either this direction or this direction. If you wanted to do a background with more of these warm colors, I would go this way. But in this case, I feel like a lot of times We're working with green backgrounds because we are doing florals, and so often it is a greener background. So that's the direction I'm going to take with my color choices today. And so I start laying them down in this order. I'll go from the yellow to the light green to a darker green, and if I want to, maybe teal. And then sometimes I'll even go ahead and add another color, something like that might be already in the flower. Let's just say I'm painting a purple flower. I might drop a little purple in, or maybe a little bit of the magenta or red. You can decide. You have to be really careful when you add these extra colors in, because they will make mud, but they can also allow you to achieve color harmony. But why don't we just get started with the greens, and then we'll talk about adding some of these other colors after. You can see my paper is buckling. You can always tape it down. I'm just going to hold it with my fingers because this is just a simple little project here today. We're just pretending we're doing a background. We don't have any subject matter here. So I'm going to go ahead with my yellow first. I don't want a lot of yellow, but I'm going to put some in, and I'm going to kind of just like, you can drop it or just kind of crisscross, do little jagged things with your brush. There's not really much method to my madness here. Just dropping that on there and creating kind of a bit of a connection or pattern. I don't want to be completely polka dot. And then I'm going to go ahead, and I've got a nice light green here, which is going to be my next color. I'll drop it in. It's a lot more watery, and so you can see it's behaving a little bit different. It's bleeding around a little bit more. Another thing to be aware when you're doing this is that the paint in your palette is going to be more concentrated than it's going to appear on your paper, because your paper is already wet, which means you're going to be diluting things even more. So you probably want to start with a little more concentration in your palette than you think you need, just because it will be getting diluted. So I'm going to just continue dropping some of this light green, and I'm kind of like enveloping the yellow. I don't want a lot of yellow left. I don't mind a few spots where it kind of peeks through, but I do want a green background. Obviously, if I had a flower here, I would be painting around it. Then I've got a couple options for dark green. This one's a little muted. This one's a little brighter. It doesn't really matter which way you go. Just go with a little bit darker. Okay, this is very concentrated. Just be aware of that. I'm going to go put it in the furthest corners, furthest away from my yellow, and then I'll just do a little bit of like massaging with my brush to bring it in. But you can do a little bit of dropping or massaging. There's a couple ways you can kind of approach this, but I'm just going to create, again, sort of a pattern. I want to create a little bit of movement here. And some of you are probably already gifted with compositional skills that you don't even know you have. And you can just create this like you're creating a pattern. You want to let the eye just gently move through your little design here. I'm going to go with the darker green. Actually, I wonder if I want, this one is kind of muted. I wonder if I want a little bit more of this. Put a little bit more. This is the one that's a little bit more on the teal green side. Darker, but I think I want a little bit more at the bottom. Quite often backgrounds are generally darker at the bottom because it's further from the light. Usually your light is coming from above, right? So you could even make this whole section here lighter. You wouldn't even have to have it dark. Sometimes you have light kind of peering through trees. Other times it is just lighter at the top, darker at the bottom. So you can kind of keep all that in mind as you paint. The paint is just almost automatically painting itself because everything's wet, and it's just got that nice shine to it. And as long as it looks shiny still, you can keep playing with your paint, adding more colors, and then going darker. I've got a nice dark kind of teal color here. I even have some indigo that I might drop in here. The indigo will kind of add a muddiness to this painting, and I'm okay with that at the bottom of this. I don't want to put it everywhere, so I'll just kind of, again, see if I can create some sort of pattern that I kind of like. And you can always just add a little water to your brush and move things around if you want to. If you introduce too much water, it will dilute your paint, but you can just clean your brush and use it more or less clean to move things around. So I'm just moving things around a little bit, encouraging them to blend. And you can kind of see how that would actually make a fairly nice background for a flower. And yes, I got a little spray there. I don't mind that, but you can always wash and dry your brush. If you get something like that happen, you can always wash and dry your brush and just kind of pick it out with the clean, thirsty brush. And then just drop a tiny little bit more of the lighter green there, maybe. You gotta be careful with this, but you can see it's because I'm so wet, things are kind of like fading out okay on their own. Now this kind of indigo color is kind of purple. It has a combination of the three primaries in it already, which is allowing this to kind of work. It would work okay with a purple or a pink flower. I feel like I've already got harmony. If you wanted to drop any other colors in there, you got to be really careful, but you can always drop a little bit, say a little touch of red here or there, and then kind of gently move it around. So you could put a little bit of red. Again, adding these extra colors, you need to do it while your paper is still shiny. I'll put a little bit more. This is just if we want to give this the suggestion of there being some flowers maybe in the background. Then I can use like a wet, slightly damp, I'd say my brush is kind of more on the wet side if I want to blend things around or drop a little bit of water around here. Just be aware, this is where things can go muddy quick, so you don't want to overwork. But you can see, you can add an extra color that would generally make mud. I kind of kept it away from the super dark green because I didn't want it to get really muddy, but you can see that worked out okay. But just have fun with this. This is a time you can play, explore, and get to understand the way that the paper is going to work for you, as well as the amount of water, pigment, all the rest. There's really not a right or a wrong. Now, if you want to do something with a little bit more linear movement, you can almost do the same thing as we did before. You're going to wet your paper first, but this time instead of dropping the color in, you're going to come in with a little bit more of a linear movement. So you can come in, I'm going to start with the yellow as at the beginning as well. And I'm just going to do some like of these kind of, almost they look like grasses, but you could say if these are iris leaves or maybe something like you even want twigs or sticks in the background, you could do this with brownish colors too. You don't have to use green. I'm just using green because I've got it here. So once again, going up and down, but not perfect vertical lines, right? I'm kind of trying to give the impression that I'm going to have some sticks or some grasses moving along here. So get that lighter green in here and then go with our darker green. This one is more concentrated, so be aware of that. And sometimes your motions here can get a little bit more like triangular, right? Because you're imagining you're painting between the lighter grasses. So I'm kind of creating almost like this weave pattern, right? So you get the impression that there's a tall, light green grass and then a darker area that's kind of behind where there's darker grass. So I'm doing a little bit of that with this. Whoops, sorry. Just go a little bit more. And then I'll even show you how to lift if you've lost some of your lighter areas. Let's go ahead and do some of this teal color. I think I'm going to need more green still. I can tell I'm like almost not, I'm dark enough. The paint's getting a little diluted. And definitely, you don't have to be as messy as me. You could have a page underneath of you that's protecting your table. Okay, I like that darker color. Again, I'm kind of doing this little bit of triangular stuff here. And these Simply Simmons brushes might be an ideal brush for doing this technique. I feel like it's giving me more water control. I've mentioned these on the channel before. This one's missing its label. These are just super cheap. I get them at Michael's, but you can get them at other art stores. And I find they're nice. They're a slightly firmer brush. They're not necessarily even designed specifically for watercolor, but they are great for beginners. They do help with water control because they hold less water. And a lot of times beginners can struggle with maybe too much water. Others can struggle with not having enough water, but I find they're good for water control. So let's go back into maybe a little bit of the indigo at the bottom. I'll just speed the video up as I keep laying on my darker colors, and then I'll show you how to lift. All right, let's talk about lifting, because let's say that maybe you've gone a little darker with your colors than you would like, and you want to have some lighter branches in here again. Maybe even want to add another color of branch. What you can do, now my water is getting very dirty, so I don't even know if I want to show you guys, but it's here. It's actually clean enough to still do this technique. I'm going to wash and dry my brush, and then I'm going to come in the lighter areas or create new light areas and just use a thirsty brush and lift. And now I'm going to do it again over here. So my brush is clean and it's thirsty, and I can lift. Wash my brush, dry my brush. Same thing, do it again. Now you could fill these areas in with a lighter green or maybe some yellow. Let's just take a little more yellow into our light green, make it a little bit more concentrated because I feel like I'm getting a little bit watery. And you can fill that area in. I'm kind of dry right now. My brush is not sopping wet, but it does have paint on it. I can kind of throw those back in. You might even be able to just create your lines with your light green, but more often than not, you're probably going to have to lift. So wash and dry your brush. You can even do it multiple times if you need to. Wash and dry, and then come back in here with the lighter green. You see how that worked? So you can create backgrounds like with these nice tall grasses or leaves, but that also gives you an idea of how you could create, say, branches. You would just do it kind of the sideways way, right? Where you could go ahead and drop in your purpley brown branches. Same sort of technique. Now that you've practiced those background techniques, you're probably wondering, that's great, but how do I keep my flower or whatever I'm painting, how do I keep it from getting messed up with the background, even if I do paint the background first? Tip number 4 is to use masking fluid. You can put masking fluid around the edge of your flower, and I show you how to do that in this video, so you can go check that out. But I also did that on this video, and it was super helpful because you can see there's a lot of little details. There's very fine stems and very fine leaves, and yet I painted the background first, which honestly made this little painting so much easier. And if you'd like to see how I do it, I'll include a link for that as well. Here's some examples of when I didn't use masking fluid, and honestly, you can tell. I'm gonna bring this up nice and close. This is a painting I did a number of years ago, and if you look up close, you can see, oh my goodness, what messy edges are around this deer here. The deer was painted first. It was actually a demo I did for a student, but then we went ahead afterwards and painted the background with a lot of texture, and it was really challenging to handle the edges around this deer. I really wish I had have done the background first and mask the edges of the deer. The thing is that I could have even added a few very fine little fur with the masking fluid, and that would have showed up beautifully. You can see on this little panda bear, I did manage to kind of paint around the light fur, and it's okay-ish, but would have been so much easier had I wanted to get that jagged fur, or even if you have an animal with longer fur or a bird with beautiful feathers, use masking fluid first, create that texture, then do your background. And then after you've done your background, you can remove the masking fluid and do your animal, your bird, your flower, whatever. This is a little bit less important if there's dark fur, like you can see here. If you have a light enough background and dark enough details on your subject, you can get away with just painting dark kind of on top. But when you're doing something light, if you've got light fur or feathers, that's where masking fluid can be super, super helpful. And as I said, you could watch either of these videos to see how I do that. If you're enjoying today's video, I would love to invite you to join my free newsletter. In it, you'll find creative inspiration and be the first to know about new tutorials, classes, and workshops. If that sounds like something you'd enjoy, you can find a link in the description below. Now let's get back to painting. Tip number 5 is to break your background up with leaves or other elements. In this case, with my most recent dahlia tutorial, the flower ended up coming to the edge of the painting, and oftentimes those petals are actually crossing outside the painting. This made the background so easy to paint. Even though the flower itself is an intermediate project, and if you're at that level, I will include a link for that in the description below. But the background was super easy. I painted it wet on wet, and I even did color mixing directly on the paper. I applied some green first, and then I came in with kind of a purpley magenta color and just kind of mixed those colors directly on the paper so that they mingled and blended together. And I was pretty happy with how the background turned out. But if you don't have a painting where that's already done for you, this tutorial, once again from my Etsy store, has multiple leaves that I ended up adding in order to make the background painting easier. So I've broken the background up by drawing extra leaves here so that this section could be painted as a whole, and then each of these other smaller sections could be painted kind of like one at a time. Not only does having a flower that either comes to the edge of your painting or adding extra leaves to help break the background up make it easier to paint the background, but this is a super helpful bonus tip. Adding those extra leaves actually anchors your subject to the edge of the painting, which is actually a compositional tip, but super important to know when you're painting backgrounds. If you had a flower and you had no leaves to connect it to the edge of the painting, this would look like it was just floating in the space. When I started to paint flower portraits, I vividly remember the frustration of painting a beautiful flower and then having it feel like it was floating because I hadn't properly anchored it with some leaves. When I went ahead and added just some simple leaves, not even too many, but I made those leaves come to the edge and then exit the painting, my flower was instantly anchored. Here's another example of a flower where the petals are actually exiting the painting, as well as a couple of these leaves, and it works really well. Plus, I have little pieces of background instead of one large background to paint. This tip is golden if you ever struggle with backgrounds that feel too large and overwhelming, or if you have objects that feel like they're floating. Tip number 6 is to push some of your elements back with glazing techniques. This sounds more complicated than it actually is. You can see with this, I added quite a few extra little details like more flower buds and some leaves, stems, and yet they kind of recede into the background, and they're not really the focal point of this painting. I wanted to keep the flowers as the focal point, and to do that, you can paint some of these wet on wet, or you can go ahead, take your background color, and just gently glaze with a light wash to kind of cover them with a little bit of that kind of indigo dark color so that they look like they're almost part of the background. So if you want a leaf to pop, leave it nice and vibrant, but if you want to push something back in your painting, add one or more glazes of your background color. Making some of my leaves nice and dark helped give depth to this painting too. You can see some of these leaves are so dark, they almost do fade into the background. They had a lot of background color in them, and that allows the leaves that I want to have pop stand out, and yet these are still here to support the painting and keep it from feeling like it's floating. This allows me to keep relatively crisp edges on my leaves, but it feels like it's part of the background because the colors kind of blend. Does that make sense? You don't have to have soft fuzzy edges, just colors that make it feel like it's melting into the background. You can see that the more of the background color you apply to any of these leaves, the more they recede into the background, almost disappearing, but still giving you a sense of depth and context. Tip number 7 is to just find a reference photo that's already naturally anchored and cropped, or crop the photo yourself. This is an example of a photo that I cropped, as well as this fuchsia here. And by cropping the flower, we automatically got it anchored. It was fun to paint this Easter lily because the background was broken into so many sections. And this dahlia happened to come from a reference photo that was already cropped, anchored, and ready to go. If you'd like to follow along step by step as I paint this entire dahlia and the background, I'll include a link to my Etsy shop below. This video class is nearly 4 hours long and will cover techniques like wet on wet, vibrant color, and neutral color shadows, as well as how I mix some of my colors directly on my paper to achieve this luminous background. And there are definitely more advanced ways to approach backgrounds, like painting the subject and the background at the same time, using negative shape painting techniques, and underpaintings. And we'll talk about some of those in future videos. For now, these tips and the videos I've linked below will give you plenty to practice and confidence to start enjoying your backgrounds. The more you play with them, the more natural they will start to feel. If you have questions about backgrounds, I'd love to hear them in the comments below. In the meantime, I hope this tutorial has brought a little taste of God's beauty and peace into your everyday life, and that it's inspired you to continue enjoying your own creative journey. See you again soon. Bye.